Hi everyone, it's Tom. I wanted to share another technique with everyone that I found really helpful over the years, and I actually didn't even realize I was doing it when I started. Someone pointed it out to me, and I guess it's an actual thing, although I don't remember what they called it when they told me this. It was a few years ago. But I do it a lot. It's really helpful. It's become a really natural part of reading for me, particularly with one-card readings. But you could do this at the end of a multiple-card reading, too, particularly if you have an outcome card that feels a little random or singular. And the basic idea here is to read cards that aren't in the reading as sort of a continuum. And I'll talk about what I mean in a few examples. You can do this with the minors, you can do it with the majors. You can even do it with the court cards, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. So I'll start off with something I actually did for someone today. It was a one-card reading, and it was about relationships, and the Six of Wands came up. And I talked a little bit about how it felt like this was a beginning of a new relationship, and the relationship felt like a really big win, a big victory, that this is something that they had waited for and worked for a long time, and they finally got this relationship, and here was this big celebration of it. And I went in to talk a little bit more about how there's a conflict, though, using elemental dignities. You can check that out in one of my other videos, because wands are fire, and it was a water question. It was a romance question. So I talked about how there can be some conflict there, because that can lead you to treating your partner as a trophy. And that was an interesting insight to the card that I hadn't thought about before. But it seemed like kind of a nasty way to end the reading. And I always like to try to find some advice there, something new to leave the person with thinking about. And I used this technique, and what it made me think about was, I had the fork in there, was that, if we look at the relationship as the continuum, so we've got, the six is not the end of the cycle, right? Because there's 10 cards in the suit. So, relationships are going to go through all these things. And I brought the other cards in, so I said, well, it's a big win now, and it feels great, and, be careful of treating your partner like a trophy. But remember this big win, because it doesn't always feel this way. Sometimes there is conflict. Sometimes there is the sort of feeling that you want to move on. Sometimes you feel like you have to defend yourself. Sometimes you feel like the relationship's a burden. But throughout all those more difficult times, you still have this win. You still have this positive thing you can come back and celebrate. So, even when things get bad, you'll come around again. And in fact, you can go on to the other cards and say there will be good times. There'll be the other ones as well. But this sort of arms you and gives you something to think about when the honeymoon's over in its way. And so that was just a basic way of looking at it, of incorporating. And I brought in all of these other cards. I didn't talk about each card, and I didn't name each one, but I used the sort of keywords of sort of some conflict, moving on, etc., in the reading to add some nuance to this card. So it helped a lot, and it gave me a practical something or other that was a little less accusatory than the insight I was getting, which is be careful not to treat people like a trophy. So that's one way that it helped, and of course that's a fairly complex way to do it, but it really does work. And I didn't get into like the 4 and the 3, etc., but I could have, because you can highlight that it's not all burden and it's not all conflict. Sometimes you do have good times. So that was one. I did another reading for someone today, too, and it was a relationship reading. Not a relationship reading in terms of romance, just in terms of life, a social life. And it was the Two of Wands reversed, and that made me feel like there was a bit of stagnation. And I talked about how, that happens from time to time. We get a little bored. We don't feel creative. We don't feel like we're producing anything interesting. And I said, my instinct was to say maybe there was something new that you could try, that there was some creative way, some new classes, or a cooking class, or, just something to spark interest and meet other people. And in that case, because it was a reversal, I let the card point me backwards. And when I did that, I thought about the Ace of Wands, and there's really no card that can symbolize some new creative juices flowing than the Ace of Wands does. So the reversal pointed me backwards, but it still pointed me to another card that, in this case, underscored my instinct, which is that it might be time to try something new and get the creative juices flowing, etc. And I did talk about the 3, because I said, well, if you do that, you might be able to reverse this and point on to the rest of the journey, and you might be able to set, these creative things that you discover trying something new, you may be able to set out into the world and actually have some productivity out of it. So that's a simpler way of doing it, and I didn't talk too much about this. I really just mentioned it in the reading, but these two really became depth for me. So this really, really helped. So that's one way to do it with the minor cards. I've done it before with the 2 of Cups once, and I let it point to a situation where it felt like, and I don't remember the specifics, but this relationship depicted here seemed to be getting in the way of friendships. So again, the 3 of Cups didn't appear in the reading, but I knew it came next, and because of the other cards around it, it made me feel like this was causing this to be reversed. So that was another way that it happened, even though that card didn't show up there. Another way to do it is to think about the court cards, and I have the courts for the Pentacles here, just because in this deck they're my favorite. But this isn't a new way of reading the court cards. In fact, I got this method from the World Spirit Tarot, where the cards, I think, are Seeker, Seer, Sibyl, and Sage. But what that made me think of is the way that I read the court cards, which is sort of as a student, and then kind of a hunter, and a doer, sort of someone mature, and then the culmination of it. So it begins on this sort of growth of maturity, and that actually also comes from the deck, although you don't see it in these cards. In the suit of Wands, you've got the chameleons on the robes of the page and the knight, which on the page they're not full circles, on the knight they're closer, on the queen they're closer. So I view the court cards as someone who's learning, looking for, doing, and sort of bringing to fruition. And so if the page comes up in a reading, I might talk about how the person is at the beginning of a journey where they're learning about something, and then they're going to go hunt it down, and then they're going to do it, and then they're going to become a master of it. So even though only the page showed up in the reading, I'll talk about the entire journey of the courts that way. So that's one way I do it with that. It's pretty simple. Another thing that you can do is similar is with the majors. And again, I've done this before where, I get the moon, and the moon is always one of those cards that seems so evasive to me. It really just feels like nighttime. And oftentimes in a reading, when I get the moon, I think, gosh, this is so unspecific, it doesn't have a lot to say. But I can sort of take a journey here, particularly in a question where someone's going through something difficult. I know that what comes next is the sun, even if it's a one-card reading. I read the sun into it to say, well, you're going to go through this darkness, but you're going to wake up. Or the same thing, you know what I mean? This newness may lead to a big awakening, which will lead you to, having whatever you want, for example. Very oversimplified. But again, it just sort of, you can use the journey of the majors. And this makes even more sense, I think, than the minors, because there really is a journey with these. We have the Fool's Journey, which is the Fool's Journal. There's the pun based on that. But and it's nice, particularly when you get a scarier card. We'll bring out the Death card again, because he can scare a lot of people, but he's not the end of the deck. He's not number 22, he's just 13. So we know that Temperance comes next. So we know that after this big, enormous transition, after this maybe scary experience even, we know we're going to have this sort of peaceful time to bring in all of the elements that we've learned from that and meld them into something new. Now we know there are other nasty things that come along later, but it can it can bring some comfort to a reading, particularly if someone's scared of this. And, I mean, the rider-waite is a pretty aggressive image. So having temperance in your back pocket to talk about as the next step can help in some cases. And there's a really interesting journey, and this is something other people have written about at length, so I won't go into too much, but of sort of this idea of the hanged man moving into death, moving into temperance. Again, it's a journey from sacrifice to death to coming out the other end of it as sort of an alchemist, as someone capable of something almost impossible. So, anyway, that is a technique that I use a lot, and it really becomes helpful, particularly in small readings, one-card readings. But you can even use it as a continuum, because if you have 3 cards, and so much majors there, you've got all this information. You can say, this happens, then this happens. And you sort of do. You can read them as this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and it leads to this. I know that there's space in between here and here, so I know that the 5 of Wands may show up. And that, after all of this victory and the victory party, there may be some conflict. So, anyway, that's just another example. So you can keep the sentence going if you want to. So that's how to read cards that aren't in the reading. And I hope you find this helpful. And if you have any questions or ideas, please feel free to let me know. And feel free to like the video or comment or share it if you are so inclined. And I hope you have a great week.